So Anastasia Stacy Collins, she, her, hers, holds an MS in LIS and an MA in children's literature, and is a research and instruction librarian for children's literature and social work at the Simmons University Library. Outside of librarianship, Stacy is a children's literature scholar and a reviewer, as well as a trauma-informed facilitator with the Anti-Racism Collaborative of Massachusetts. She is the author of Language, Power, and Oppression in the LIS Diversity Void, the Cultural Doings and Undoings of the Sidney Taylor Book Award, and the Simmons Anti-Oppression Guide. Her work and scholarship centers the denaturalization and dismantling of systemic oppression in the intertwining fields of youth literature and librarianship. And you can follow her online at Dark Literata. So Stacy, I will hand over the microphone to you.
Thank you, Shannon. Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen in like just a second. Once I can't actually click things and talk at the same time, y'all. I don't know how a year hasn't trained me to do this yet. Okay. All right, and just to sort of preface this, I do want to let you know that I will be turning my video off once I sort of get started here. A year of Zoom time I've basically spent the entire year looking at my own face when I am in Zoom calls. And I say my face does a lot of talking and it's very distracting. So I'm gonna turn off my video while I'm talking, but then I'll be back for the Q&A, which I will absolutely take questions at the end of the talk. Do feel free, as folks have already been doing, to throw questions or thoughts into the chat in the meantime. I do want to sort of preface this by saying I was asked to sort of do this end of the day talk, and I do recognize it's the end of the day, and some of you all have been here since noon, so I understand the fatigue. Please get water, body breaks, all that good stuff. But I also sort of want to situate what I was asked to do. So I'm sort of in between these two talks, this one that's happening today and tomorrow, and also the symposium that happened in 2019. I was a presenter in that. It's recorded. You can go and watch all my awkwardness, even right now. But sort of in wrapping up today, to sort of think about like how these two conversations connect. And one connection that I have found, so just as a preview for what I'm going to talk about, is that I am still angry. And I'm going to dig into and expand on that anger in a minute, but that's sort of the preview. The connection I'm finding between these two talks right now is that I'm mad. And maybe by the end of this, you'll be mad too. Okay, so I'm going to turn off my video now, and I will see you all on the other side. She says as she doesn't turn off the video. Goodness. There we go. All right. Okay, so my talk today is titled "Right Back Where We Started From," or "Where We Go From Here." Folks maybe know "Right Back Where We Started From" is a song title. I throw song titles at everything. You already heard, you can follow me at Dark Literata on Twitter and Instagram. I do more on Twitter, and what I do on Twitter is actually a lot of what you're going to see me do in this talk, which is repeating what other people have said and stringing it together to say, look at all this cool conversation that's happening. Okay. So to get started, I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement, and in full transparency, I debated whether I was going to do this or not because I think land acknowledgements are a bad idea, but rather because they're sometimes not done very well. And I don't think there's maybe like a universal, here is the right way to do a land acknowledgement. So please don't take what I have come up with as an example of that. But I want to say, if it is imperfect, which I agree it is entirely with me, and not in terms of the act of acknowledging Native folks and the lands and the unceded lands that we operate on. So I'm gonna read this for anybody that can't read off the screen. So the land on which my institution sits conducts business and offers higher education opportunities which includes master's and PhD level LIS education, is the original homelands of the Mashpee Wampanoag, the Aquinnah Wampanoag, the Nipmuc, and the Massachusetts tribal nations. I'll also mention that among my institution's faculty, staff, and student bodies, these nations have no significant representation, which is pretty par for the course when it comes to Native erasure. I'm acknowledging my place in the history of violent genocide and forced removal from this territory. My work today is in part possible because of it. And I want to name the role of librarianship in the ongoing erasure of the Indigenous peoples connected to this land and the Indigenous knowledge practices and practitioners in the LIS field. For anybody who's joining today or watching down the road, who are in Massachusetts or the New England area, you can find more information and support opportunities at the North American Indian Center of Boston and the Mashpee Wampanoag websites. Both URLs are listed here. And for more information about issues that are impacting Indigenous peoples and ways to support their work as patrons and also inside the profession, the American Indian Library Association and the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums are excellent places to start. Just like all of the other non-white folks in librarianship, Indigenous folks are not only have to navigate the harms of systemic racism and settler colonialism in and outside of LIS, they're also tasked with fixing those systems for themselves and for their communities. And you can see some of that. I've listed just 2 projects here I've listed that is doing some of that work. So the AILA, the American Indian Library Association, has a committee, the Subject Access and Classification Committee, which has a wiki that describes all of the work that they have been doing to improve access to information and addressing misinformation about Native Americans, specifically by, of course, tackling subject access and classification issues. So I just want to uplift that. And then also the Digital Atlas of Native American Intellectual Traditions is exactly what it sounds like. It is a project out of Amherst, so the other end of Massachusetts from where I am. And it's a conversation and collaboration space for developing a network and framework for Native authored library and archival collections. So two amazing projects that are seeking to disrupt the erasure that's happening in the field for the benefit of Native folks that are outside of the field and that make use of our spaces and resources. And the last bit of my acknowledgement here is to say that this acknowledgement does not exist in a past tense or historical context. Colonialism is a current, ongoing project and process of oppression. And as I get into the main part of this talk, I am absolutely including and uplifting Native library workers doing any kind of Native-centered anti-racist work in the profession as part of the marginalized groups in LIS who need protection and support. Okay. Now, I want to preface the rest of the talk by saying I'm not going to be giving you all examples of people who've been harassed and doxxed and swatted. One, because there are plenty of examples in and outside of an LIS context that are easily findable with a Google search or a Twitter search. And including the recordings of the last symposium in 2019, where folks literally presented and talked about their experiences with harassment, online harassment because of their work, including mine. And 2, there's a disturbing trend on the rise in our field, where the sort of the spectacle of terror and trauma that's committed against our marginalized members is being sort of played on a loop. This happened to so-and-so who has this book coming out. This happened to so-and-so who just got this grant. This happened to so-and-so who, posted a comment on a website about a book series. And it's played on a loop for the benefit of non-marginalized folks who aren't impacted by that kind of racism and vitriol and hateful speech and harassment. And it sort of allows them to perform outrage and shock. I can't believe that people are so terrible. Why would anybody do this? You're amazing. This is awful. But it sort of re-solidifies how the folks that aren't impacted by it are not really paying attention to it until it happens. And that's part of what I'm going to talk about today, part of the problem I'm going to talk about today. So I don't want to contribute to that trend. And I'm also going to be unpacking that idea of performance and performativity a little later. So instead of a bunch of examples of here are people who were hurt and it's awful and we should be doing better, I instead want to talk about sort of the state of this crisis. And it is a crisis. And the state of it is that it is ongoing. So just in case anybody is unfamiliar with sort of online harassment and cyberbullying as a thing, we had a wonderful overview from Dr. Phillips earlier in the day. But when we talk about sort of the harassment that library workers encounter, especially when they are doing diversity, equity, inclusion, social justice, anti-oppression kind of work, we are seeing several types of harassment, or they are at risk of several types of harassment. The first being obviously physical harassment and violence, somebody showing up to their workplace when they are on shift and walking up to the desk and yelling at them, threatening violence, etc. Online harassment, like Dr. Phillips talked about, can happen in a much more, sort of inhuman kind of terrible way, precisely because people don't have to be fully human to exist online. And so, and also because they can be anonymous. So online harassment on social media, via email, all of those kinds of attacks. Some specific examples and sort of an escalation of online harassment would be doxing, which is, I'm forgetting what it is short for, but it includes documents, basically making your personal documents or personal information and releasing it onto the internet or in a particular space where folks have access to it and can then harass you further. This could be your address, your social security number. It could be emails that they requested from like Information Freedom Act kind of stuff, and just basically putting more personal aspects of you out to the world and the public without your permission. Swatting is probably, probably the most terrible, egregious, highest risk. Maybe it's unfair to rank them like that, but it's one that like keeps me up at night. Swatting is when if someone has access to your address, whether it is a work address or your home address, more likely your home address, they will call in some kind of activity, criminal activity, terrible whatever activity to law enforcement, which results in a SWAT team being sent to your home or your place of work. It pretty much doesn't matter what they say to get the SWAT team there, because the bad thing is when the SWAT team is there, particularly for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. To suddenly have a SWAT team and a bunch of armed law enforcement in their home. It results in terror at best and death at worst. So that's sort of what we're looking at. This is the ongoing crisis. This is what folks are sort of at risk of as we do this work in our profession. And what we've seen in 2020 with COVID-19 and pandemic is the same kind of examples of this, right? So we've seen an uptick in physical and in-person harassment from patrons about mask policies, about distancing and cleaning precautions, if services in the library had to be altered and the patrons are simply not happy about it. We're seeing a lot of folks getting in library workers' faces who often had made no call, had no role in making the call about what those services would look like, or those folks are the folks that are being the most protected by things like masking policies and cleaning and altered services. Like these folks are being protected from a deadly virus and then getting yelled at by patrons because of it. We have also, of course, because of the pandemic and an uptick in racism and hateful rhetoric from government officials, among others, we're seeing an uptick in the same kind of harassment, physical and online, towards Asian American, Pacific Islander American library workers. Even worse if you are sort of on the front lines and folks are also unhappy about masking and whatnot. That all of that is sort of an uptick. But I will say we have also seen in patrons sort of in that harassment being addressed, we see a lot more of discussion about how How does a library handle communicating to patrons that masking needs to be followed? How do you enforce this if a patron is adamant, et cetera, or is getting loud or violent with staff? Not as much talking about, well, what do you do if your Asian staff members are being targeted specifically as Asian people? In part of the misinformation and the hateful rhetoric around Asian folks and around this virus. There's not a lot talking about what libraries can do to support those folks in those instances. And that is an odd disparity. Emphasis on the, and I'm being sarcastic, the odd is sarcastic. It's very much par for the course, which we're going to talk about right now. So what we're seeing in this crisis, right? So first we're seeing online attacks against library workers doing equity and social justice work. It is a crisis, is itself a crisis. But it also intersects with other ongoing crises, including systemic racism, transphobia, ableism, other areas of oppression. And the linchpin of these as crises is that none of these are actually treated as crises by the white LIS establishment. Institutions, our institutions, our field, even individual colleagues do not necessarily treat either of these, the targeted harassment that folks are receiving, and also how that ties in with the other crises. None of them are being treated as crises. And so there is just sort of an ongoing state of crisis, which can be, as we have seen from the pandemic, as its own ongoing state of crisis, that can be an enormous amount of wear and tear on the individuals who are most impacted by it. And I've put this little screenshot of the coverage of where this particular conversation that we're having today and tomorrow, sort of where it got started, which was a panel in ALA Annual in 2018. So a nice solid, coming up on 3 years of this particular branch of a very big discussion has been happening for 3 years, and we're still very much at the same place. And it's important to mention, right, the folks who are doing this work, right? So right now and historically, the people that are doing most of this equity and social justice work, this work to address these crises of racism, transphobia, ableism, oppression in the field, are also the folks who are most impacted by it. And mountains of work is happening. Mountains are moving because of this work. So why are we still here with this other aspect of it? Mountains are moving around changes to better librarianship, but this aspect of what it means to be doing that work hasn't changed at all in at least 3 years of conversation. So what's going on? This is what's going on. So why are we still here? I made this meme. You're welcome to copy and use it for stuff. I'm very fond of the damn meme. It usually captures things quite well. But essentially, this is our problem, right? We have a lot of solidarity statements of every kind you can imagine. It's happening from individuals, colleagues, very sincere in their solidarity, in their support, appalled at the vitriol that their colleagues are being exposed to by doing this work. Organizations also committed, writing up whole statements, changing their mission statements sometimes even, and a commitment from national level organizations, ALA and whatnot. And then, so we have this lovely dam, this big wall of solidarity statements that are holding back, the terribleness of racism, of oppression that makes this work harder to do. But then we have the big giant hole in the dam, which is no actual solidarity action. So solidarity statements, sentiment, sincerity, you mean it. It's absolutely a statement that you stand behind and represents your actual thoughts, the organization's actual stance, but it is not reflected or embodied in any significant solidarity action. And there is our problem. This is why the crisis is ongoing. This is why the flow of this particular water, stream, river, whatever, continues. And continues right now. As we're sitting and having this conversation, somebody has received a racist email. All right. So digging a little further into this question of why we're still here. So I've got two quotes here. One is So I actually just heard Katrina Kendrick speak and talk about low morale and sort of give a detailed overview in the Calm virtual conference. If anybody else was there, it was sort of aimed at library middle managers and whatnot. She was the sort of opening act, the opening keynote, and it really this definition that she sort of has, it's an ongoing definition that she keeps sort of updating as she does yet another study on low morale in different spaces and among different groups in librarianship. But this really resonated with me, and what I was sort of noticing in this trend of like why this crisis remains not unsolved is the wrong word, but also unaddressed. And so what she says is that low morale is the repeated and protracted exposure to emotional, verbal, or written, system, and physical abuse or neglect in the workplace. And I'm going to come back to this, but just sort of like let that simmer for a second. The other quote I have here is from Catherine Pugh. This is from a piece that I absolutely love. It's a piece that's available on Medium. You can go and read it right now. That's called basically there's no such thing as a white ally. And this quote is sort of the premise of the piece, if you had to sum it up in one sentence. And I think it also captures some of what we're seeing in how our profession and our organizations at structural and institutional levels, that the framework for this particular crisis is inappropriate, and it has a big gap in reality, which is how the crisis continues because it's not being treated as one. So what this quote says, this is not about your heart or your hard work or your good deeds. This is about and only about the damage behind defining as help a thing that is your duty. And this when I say it sums up the premise of the article effectively says, if white people continue to treat racism as a Black and Indigenous and people of color problem that white people help with, then racism will be with us forever until the end of time. But if we address that and say, no, change your perspective, you need to be thinking of this as a white people problem. Racism is a white people problem. It is a white people problem that harms non-white people. And so the idea of defining, addressing your problem as help instead of duty, that's where sort of this problem is encapsulated. So instead, this is something you need to address because it is your problem. So when we talk about this crisis of folks being targeted for work that is meant to uplift a field that actively harms them, trying to address the systems and those harm inside the field, and then getting a bunch of harm and attack from outside and within the field for doing it, that being seen as a problem for marginalized people. Oh, I'm so sorry that happens to you as a marginalized person doing this work. That's awful. Let me know how I can help. That is not the appropriate attitude. And we need to shift and say, the reason we're still here is because our organizations, our profession, our managers, our colleagues need to accept this as their problem that is harming marginalized people. And as your problem, it's something you need to deal with, not help with, but deal with. And so this actually sort of brings me back to this low morale question and this idea of neglect. The tweet that I have screenshotted down here was the person tweeted it just a couple of days ago, talking about her experience. She has a new book out. She's done a ton of work around Latinx youth literature and youth cultures, has this new book out, and so has gotten a lot of recent attention, including racist emails. And this tweet, it triggered something. I hesitate to call it triggering, but it was more like it flashed something in my brain and it stayed with me for hours and hours. I kept thinking like, yeah, racist emails must mean you're doing something right. And it sounds so utterly correct. And yet there's something so deeply wrong with it. And it is, I think, embedded in this idea of neglect as a enabling and central part of low morale. And the idea that as our organizations, individual managers, individual colleagues, as a crisis that is owned by those institutions being treated as an individual problem, and sometimes completely ignored, that neglect brings on this attitude of resignation. If I'm going to do this good work for my own community that uplifts people like me, that uplifts me myself, that begins addressing this huge gap in service and ethics of our field, I'm just going to have to deal with racist emails. I'm just going to have to deal with exposure to hatred, to attacks, to harassment that is degrading, and I'm trying to find the right word, but it is exhausting, and that doesn't capture it. It is tiring on an almost inhuman level, and yet it is something that you have to carry as you carry on. And so this idea of like resigning, like, right, so the folks doing this work being resigned to that exposure to this kind of terror in its way, terror and harassment is simply part and parcel of what it is to do this work to make our field better, is embedded within this idea of neglect and the low morale of our profession, which again brings us back to this is a profession problem, which means the profession, the institutions, the folks who have power in the profession need to be addressing it, as opposed to leaving it to individuals to solve for themselves. Which is interesting that this is a gap that we're seeing, considering how many statements of solidarity are out there, and the question of like, how can you be in solidarity? Can you say you're in solidarity and then do nothing that's actually supportive? And that is where we come around to this question of performativity, the sort of performance of allyship and support. Folks have most likely heard this phrase before. I've talked about it before. It's actually what I talk about probably most of the time. But we're seeing it in a very particular way. We're seeing it play out in a very particular way with this crisis that we've now been talking about for 3 years. And so I have just a brief definition, right? So performative allyship is when someone from a non-marginalized group professes support and solidarity with a marginalized group in a way that either isn't helpful or that actively harms that group. I regularly bring up the safety pins. Folks probably remember the safety pins. That was not just a library, like a librarianship, performative allyship incident. It was wider than that, but a lot of librarians were very excited about putting on a safety pin to let their patrons know that they were an ally, that they were supportive, and did no action beyond that, right? So wearing a safety pin doesn't actually help anybody. And nobody's going to assume that because you have a safety pin on that you're a safe person. And sometimes it also went over the line into actively harming, where folks who were wearing a safety pin were absolutely in situations where they could have intervened, could have been helpful, and did nothing. And then there's also the folks who got on social media and other online spaces and decided to yell and scream and harass marginalized people who dared to point this out, who pointed out that this was performative, that it actually did nothing at all helpful, that, your actions spoke a lot louder than safety pins. And so then decided to actually be actively racist by saying, no, my safety pin is amazing and you're trash. Yes, so fun times, safety pins, forever my favorite. The other piece of this, that performative allyship usually involves the ally receiving some kind of reward. So this definition, right, sounds like at an individual level, but it can absolutely exist at institutional, structural, profession-wide levels, right? Appearing to be an ally, using the correct rhetoric, producing a beautifully wordsmith, really like touches the soul kind of statement about solidarity, about condemning racism, ableism, any other aspect of oppression, is a signal that is meant to provide a reward, right? It is, hey, look at us. This is our stance. This is who we truly are. This is how you should think of us. You should think of us this way. And the reward is, of course, being thought of as that way, being thought of as progressive, being thought of as an authority on this, being thought of as a great place to work, a great group of people to have on a panel, et cetera, et cetera. And so even if the reward isn't necessarily the motivating factor, it's in there. And sometimes the reward is simply not being seen as racist, right? Like, oh, they've got this great statement that they quote unquote stand behind. they probably aren't racist. And that itself is a reward. And if that is the main impetus for the statement, then that's a problem. Right? As any statement should ultimately be reflective of action that either is planned, and therefore the plan should exist also, or has already happened. This is what we are doing. And so the idea of, for example, I have here at the bottom, right, an anti-racist statement about working toward praxis, right? Like there should be praxis. There should be praxis, and the statement should be addressing and summing up, giving a nice snapshot of what the praxis is, not about saying, hi, we would really like to be anti-racist. So if you could just assume that of us until we get ourselves together, that'd be really helpful. That's not how it works. And this is another quote from Catherine Pugh from the same article. And she's talking about how the problem with, I don't see color, I'm colorblind, I don't have a racist bone in my body, that those kinds of statements to emphasize somebody not being part of the problem of racism. And what she says is, if you center around you, right? So a bunch of statements about you, a thing that you are doing for me, right? Supposedly allyship for me, then you're doing it wrong. So statements, again, right? Statements of solidarity that are all about the organization, all about the profession, the profession's commitment, the institution's deep commitment and connection and support for anti-racism, for anti-ableism, for anti-oppression, for equity. If that's it, if the statement is centered on you and what you are committed to learning, committed to doing, committed to supporting, then you're doing it wrong, because that is not centering the folks that actually need to be centered, or the work that needs to be centered. It is just a statement. All right, so now that everybody's all nicely depressed, let's talk about where we can go from here. And the emphasis on statements that I'm making, I'm not calling out any particular solidarity statement in particular. It's all of them. And so the question of where do we go from here, right? If we haven't moved forward at all, if we're still very much in the same place that we were, how do we start moving forward? And my answer to that is that we have to resist this idea of constantly being at square one. We are not at square one. Again, mountains have been moved in this field. The idea that at organizational and professional levels, we pretend that they have not, and that everybody is still learning, that everybody is going to screw up because there's just not enough information, or we just don't know how to recognize these things as they happen, or we don't know how to deal when so much hatred from outside, from people on the internet just suddenly rains down upon us. We just don't know what to do. This is not the case. And in fact, if we shifted our energy from talking about it, from making statements about how much we care, and instead focused it on demonstrating and taking action, we could move past this idea that we are at square one, because we're not. And so this quote that I have here is from a piece by Alex Green. And I'm going to forget the title. Wow, I'm sorry. It's on my last slide. So yeah. Anyway, this is the Having Conversations piece. I constantly call it the Having Conversations industrial complex, which is a term that Green actually uses in the piece. But this quote is probably my favorite. It comes towards the end of the piece and says, having conversations obscures the insidious creep of normalization, the practice by which an intolerable state of affairs becomes business as usual, by treating structures of violence as partners in search of solutions. And this applies here. It applies to many, many, many aspects of oppression and anti-oppression work that gets stalled because of having conversations. And having conversations can look like, oh, let's stop and let's talk about something that's less charged first, right? Let's have a conversation about unconscious bias before we talk about racism. Let's talk about the benefits of universal design before we start talking about ableism. Or let's form a committee to make sure this is actually a problem before we, subject people to, being decent human beings to other people. So this idea of normalization, I think, is also something that's happening. I think it is also connected to that question of neglect that leads to low morale and contributes to the resignation, the attitude, this idea that doing this work means exposure at a very personal and exhausting level. And so instead of talking, instead of write up a statement that conveys to people how supportive we are of them, while also not totally alienating the racists and white supremacists and ableists and TERFs, you know, sort of among us, both in the profession and also among our patrons. We don't want to fully alienate them. That would be terrible. So instead, we spend a lot of time figuring out how do we talk about this in a way that is supportive, but not too you know, deep dive involved. How do we recognize this as a problem that needs to be solved, but also don't sort of overcommit to the idea that it is our responsibility to solve it. And my suggestion to how to move past that is to stop doing it, to see normalization for what it is, to resist the idea that this problem needs to be talked about anymore. And in fact, action needs to happen right now. And part of that is seeing the crisis, seeing this crisis, which is connected to other ongoing crises in the field, is part of resisting normalization. Stop seeing it as an individual's problem. Stop seeing it as, oh, well, you wrote a book, so you should have known you were going to get a bunch of emails. No, this is a library worker being targeted for work they are doing to improve our organization and our profession. It is absolutely our problem as a library. This is not an individual being targeted. This is the library being targeted. And so we are going to address it on the scale of the library. The individual will be protected within that, but we're also going to be making it clear that in terms of conduct directed towards the library as both a brick and mortar building, but also a group of humans that provide service, that conduct is expected to treat them as humans. And in the meantime, there are other things that can be done to protect individuals, to make sure that terrible people on the internet who are anonymous and free to be as terrible as they like do not have an easy time finding this person to target. Sorry, a small aside. I was thinking about this literally an hour ago. There's a Netflix miniseries where that was, I think it's Martin Scorsese, who is friends with Franny Leibowitz, but basically put Franny Leibowitz in a Netflix miniseries where Franny Leibowitz just talks about living in New York culture and life. It's fascinating to watch for me. But she says something near the start of it. When somebody asks her a question about how to navigate the many different types of people in New York and the crowds of people, and so many people in New York who want to pretend that New York is, that there's nobody else, right? They folks will walk around on the streets as if there is nobody else on the street, and that doesn't really work when you're in a city like New York. And what she says is the way to navigate that is to pretend it's a city. So her answer to this question of how do you navigate all of these people all over the place, treating each other in various not great ways, how do you navigate? And she says, pretend it's a city. And so the answer to this question of where do we go from here? How do we move forward? I think the answer is we need to pretend it's a crisis. We need to pretend it's a crisis for libraries, a crisis for LIS as a profession, and stop thinking of it and treating it as a crisis for an individual. That it is a problem for an individual. It is a crisis that is impacting the entire field, and we are hemorrhaging people that are doing this great work, who are burnt out, who are tired, who do not need their career to be about, to have their careers work and impact come part and parcel with exposure to vitriol and harassment. All right. So in my call to action here, I have one last quote for you, and I want to be clear. I want to be transparent that I know exactly how many quotes from other people I have put in this presentation. It is on purpose. One, because these folks have said things so beautifully, and I want to point you toward their work, and I want to point you to the fact of how what they're talking about interconnects. But I also want to make it clear that I am saying nothing new. This is a call to action. We're talking about moving forward from a place we have been for a very long time, but I do not want to leave anyone with the misconception that this is something that hasn't been talked about. We've been talking about it for 3 years. We've been talking about it quite loudly for 3 years. It has been a problem for at least 6 decades, if not more. And then of course the advent of the internet makes it a whole new level of problem. Yes, but it's a problem, a change in delivery, not a change in the actual like nature of the problem. So again, I am not the first person to say any of this, which I hope is pretty clear from the fact that I can find a bunch of people who have said it in the last couple of years just for this presentation. But the last quote I want to leave you with is from Brené Brown. You've no doubt heard of Brené Brown, prolific author, and very quotable. Her work has appeared in a bunch of virtual conferences I've seen in the last several weeks. And this quote, I think, is one she's very well known for, and it is, "Clear is kind, unclear is unkind." And this can mean pretty much anything. You can apply it to anything. Her book, the book that it's in, is about leadership, and ways to stop jerking people around as a leader, as a manager, and instead being clear and straightforward and a partner in the work that you're doing. And I like it for this talk, for this topic, for this problem, for this crisis, for this call to action to do something. I like it because it means a bunch of things. First of all, we can be clear and therefore kind by having a crisis management plan. And if there are managers, supervisors, administrators among the audience here today, I am very much talking to you. Do you have something on the books? Do you have even a general idea of who a person could go to if they suddenly start experiencing an attack because they put together a LibGuide, because they made a post on the library social media, because they received a grant to do work, and now suddenly everybody is yelling at them online? So best practices in that kind of online harassment management, either an internal protocol of what you're going to do, who the person can talk to, how to document, how to remove identifying and personal information from your websites and digital spaces, notification if a person's emails have been requested under a Freedom of Information Act of some sort, not just sort of like, oh yeah, IT provided this and then never told me. Responses to media outlet requests for comment, whether those outlets are in good faith or not. How will you respond to it? Should the individual respond to it? I'll tell you right now, the answer to that is no. But are you not going to respond to it at all, or are you going to send it up the ladder to someone? Who will that be? Well-being check-ins and schedule and work adjustments if necessary, if that is best for the person being targeted. And then the last little thing I have here is some kind of toolkit, and I don't really care who creates it. It could be ALA, it could be a particular caucus, it could be a roundtable, it could be the Library Freedom Project. In fact, they might actually have one, but some kind of toolkit for developing protocols. So if you don't have one on the books and you're like, oh my God, where do I start? That's okay. There are many places to start. Start with all of the resources that have been directed at individuals. Hi, you're an individual who's doing some kind of activism and you've been targeted online. Here's some things you should do in the first 24 hours, in the first 72. Take that and figure out how to make it institutionally applicable for your institution, clearly and kindly. And to sort of wrap up here, in the spirit of clear is kind, I want to extend the kindness of being as clear as possible when I say that every time a marginalized person in LIS experiences targeted harm for their diversity, equity, and inclusion work, their social justice work, their anti-oppression work, their discussion of any of that in any online space, etc. Every instance is a failure. It's a failure on the part of the colleagues, the managers, the institutions, and the profession that should have protected them. And I don't say that to be unkind. In fact, I say it to be kind. I say it to be kind. I don't say it to discourage learning or efforts to do more or to do better. And folks are going to have an excellent opportunity tomorrow in learning bystander training that, again, can also be translated into structural responses and interventions. I say it only to emphasize that we are very late. We are late in responding to this crisis. And in the meantime, as we are late, in the meantime, people striving to make LIS and librarianship better for people like them who are our patrons and our communities, and also our communities and colleagues. They are being exposed to rather than insulated from hate. And that should be an enormous motivator. And I hope it will be. So again, it's a failure, it's a problem. It's your problem. And other people are being hurt as they deal with your problem. So let's fix it. And that's where I'm going to leave you. There are a few resources listed here. There are tons. This is a small sample, some of which were also part of the resources listed in the 2019 symposium. You can find that on the 2019 symposium's website. A few of the references that I talked about just now, I recommend all of them. None of them are actually about librarianship except Katrina Kendrick's piece. But I recommend all of them and to think about how they might apply to your institution, your working spaces, your roundtables or committees or anything that you're sort of a part of, and how some of what they're talking about here could be something that changes the way you operate or changes perspective. And so with that, I am open to questions. I am going to come back on screen, maybe. Yay. And I'll stop sharing my screen so that I can see you all, but I'm happy to bring it back up if there's a question about something.
Thank you, Stacy. Thank you. Everybody give Stacy a round of applause. Give her some kudos in the chat box so she can know how amazing she is and how amazing the presentation was. So thank you, Stacy. If does anyone have any questions for Stacy, you can put it in the chat box or you can put it in the form, but right now there are not any questions in the form. So any questions? The chat box is open. They love your presentation, Stacy. So a lot of thank yous, a lot of terrific presentations, so amazing. Are you all questioned out, or did Stacy just wow you? And oh, there's a question. Where can we find a link to the reference listed or mentioned?
Those will be included on the website probably by the end of today or end of tomorrow.
Awesome. Thank you. And we just got a question in the on the Google Doc. It says, what song lyrics and or songs are the ones you use when thinking about and discussing dismantling white supremacy?
Oh my gosh. That's such a great, I'd have to go through. I mean, so occasionally folks will like ask me for title ideas because there's nothing more fun than trying to create a title when you only have a tiny bit of information. And it ends up being a lot more useful if you use something like a cultural reference that song lyrics often are. But when, oh my gosh, almost anything. And it depends on what you're talking about. If you're talking about resisting like white supremacy culture, you can use pretty much any song. Actually, oddly enough, like Taylor Swift songs. I'm not fully convinced that like Taylor Swift is not very much embedded within white supremacy culture, but that's a different conversation for a different day. And in the meantime, she has a number of lyrics and song titles that work very nicely when you're talking about challenging white assumptions about what's possible, the sort of limits of the white imagination of what's doable and what things can look like. And that can be super fun, especially when it's like, it's a song, you get a song in someone's head and now you've changed that song for them forever because it's about denigrating white supremacy. It's great.
And there's another question came in the chat box that says, how do we get people to own their problem? Any suggested techniques or skills would be helpful.
This is a great question. And it's making me think of a question that somebody asked Dr. Phillips in the first presentation about emotional literacy and the idea of I think kind of the idea of empathy. So there's the pragmatic approach right there. This is going to be different for different people, different workspaces, different managers, whatever. But I think the the basic pragmatic approach, right, is to use their language to discuss it, right? So it's saying like, oh, this is how this work is good for the library, right? This is how this benefits us, how it makes us more attractive. This is how it rewards us and improves us as a library without you having to do a thing, right? You're not even the target of the harassment. This is great. But if we allow the people doing this work to be targeted and harassed, then we're exposing ourselves to a big, wide, terribleness. And right, so libraries as entities in general are very risk averse. And so in talking about it in terms of risk, talking about in terms of what it means for a member of the library community who works for the library to be targeted in this way, is simply a phrasing it in terms of like a basic crisis management protocol, like putting it on the books in sort of managery type terms can set folks at ease, right? This is not something that you're necessarily putting into action because this thing needs to be done right now. It does. It's an ongoing crisis. It's an ongoing risk. But framing it as preventative, framing it as proactive goes a long way to making folks both, right? It's the idea of having it so ideally you never need it. That tends to put folks at ease. And also recognizing that the folks in power are only going to be impacted by this if the folks sort of at the front line, doing the frontline work, or doing, this, working on this grant or working on these reading lists or whatnot that is drawing attention, that they're only going to be exposed if this person is exposed, and you can literally limit the exposure if you simply have a plan in place. I don't think that's necessarily going to address the problem of if these folks don't own their problem, will this make them own their problem? No. I think if folks are not prepared to own the problem as theirs, as this is a library issue and we're going to solve it at these levels and structural levels, then it can simply be you trick them into doing it by writing up proposals, writing up a protocol, writing up something that makes it their problem, but doesn't actually tell them that it's their job to solve it. And that's work. That is diversity work that that Sarah Ahmed talks about, the work of diversity work. But once it's in place and once it is policy, then it doesn't matter who's sitting in that chair or in that position. They own the problem because the policy says they do. It is not a perfect solution, but it can be workable, especially if folks are pretty reticent to saying, well, it's your work, and so I'm sorry that people are targeting you, but there's nothing the library can do, because it's simply not true.
So I think we have time for one more question, and I pulled it from the chat box. It says, as a low-level supervisor, how do I pressure those managers above my level to actually create I'm sorry, I skipped. As a low-level supervisor, how do I start creating that plan? Doing it in isolation won't work right. So how to organize the administrators who would have the power to do something like that?
Mm-hmm. Again, there's no cookie cutter level. I see JJ already responded with a great one. Bring it up in every meeting. Yes. So like just flood, absolutely drown them in what ifs, drown them in, hey, if we just had this would solve a lot of things or would prepare us for a lot of things. If your organization has some kind of internal temperature taking tools, a pulse survey, anything that sort of checks in on concerns among the staff, this could be brought up as one. Folks at the top love data, give them data. There's also like drawing up, this is why I say like a toolkit is nice, so that folks don't feel like they're starting from zero. And as organizations, national organizations, if they are providing sort of a template, then one, it speaks to the necessity and the way that our field should be thinking about these kinds of plans and proactive measures, which is a huge step forward. But it also gives folks a place to start so they don't feel like they're starting from zero or don't know what they're doing. Yes, what was the other thing I was going to say? I agree, doing it in isolation won't work, because you're one person, and if you're not a person who's necessarily going to be targeted, then like how useful will it be? But again, starting from templates if you can find them, but starting from all of the recommendations, and there's some in the resources that I listed here, where folks are sort of saying, this is what you can do as if you as an individual have been targeted online, if you've been doxxed, here's how you can protect yourself. Look at what those recommendations are. What might that protection look like proactively? What do you need to sort of have in place? Who do you at least know who can do what, right? Who in IT can pull this information from the website? Who, on the desk can be shuffled around to make sure that this person is now working in the back instead of working up front for a couple of weeks. Those sort of things. And then presenting something of a plan. It doesn't have to be completely finished, but presenting that together to folks who are higher up, and then keep poking them. Hey, what about this? Oh, is this meeting, are we having this meeting talking about weeding? Well, let's definitely also put on the agenda making sure that this proactive plan and crisis and online harassment protocol is part of it, because there's no way we can weed books and not have people yelling at us online. So let's talk about what this might look like. There's almost no discussion where you can't figure out how to shoehorn it in. And again, that's work. It's not ideal. Ideally, leaders would be super excited to talk about this and have it on the books. Thank God you mentioned it. I had no idea where to start. This is fantastic. Let's get it here. But if not, and you've got pushback, then just keep poking them until and ask why, right? Ask why not have this? Why not have this? That's my favorite question, is why not have this? Because the answer to that is usually, well, we don't care, or some other thing that is actually nonsensical. And eventually when they when they figure out that they don't have an answer to the question why not, is when you actually get them to implement stuff, which is good. So constantly bring it up. Have something that you can hand them as like, this is something that we could put in place very quickly, and educate the staff about it to know about what's going on and what they need to do. And then ask them why not if they say no.
Awesome. Stacy, thank you so much.